Have you ever experienced something unexplainable in your life? Something so bizarre it kept you up at night? Nestled in the town of Willowbrook, not too far from the hustle of the city, resided a woman named Charlotte Evans. Her home was a charming little house at the end of Evergreen Lane. Each day, as the sun peeked over the horizon, Charlotte would start the day with a steaming cup of coffee every day. She sipped from her favorite mug, a treasured ceramic piece with painted sunflowers. But not all was as tranquil as it seemed in Charlotte's world. A bizarre occurrence began to disrupt her peaceful, routine mornings. Every time she stepped away from her kitchen, leaving her coffee mug momentarily unattended, she'd return to find it mysteriously empty. Not a single drop remained, as if the coffee had vanished into thin air. It was a puzzle that seemed to defy all logic, a riddle that left Charlotte scratching her head in bewilderment. At first, Charlotte brushed it off, attributing the disappearances to her forgetfulness, or perhaps a trick by her tired eyes. But as the phenomenon persisted, it became impossible to ignore. The coffee never spilled, it never left a trace, it simply disappeared. It was an enigma that began to consume Charlotte's thoughts, a mystery that turned her tranquil mornings into a perplexing puzzle. Haunted by this inexplicable incident, Charlotte could no longer enjoy her morning ritual. Her cup of coffee had now become a source of anxiety now. She would fear leaving the cup anywhere unattended. It was an eerie occurrence, a peculiar phenomenon that seemed to defy the laws of nature. Unsettled, Charlotte decided to turn detective, determined to get to the bottom of this uncanny occurrence. Little did she know, she was about to embark on an extraordinary journey, one that would forever change her perception of the world around her. In her pursuit of answers, Charlotte began a series of experiments. She was a woman of logic and reason. She was determined to unravel the mystery of her vanishing coffee. She would place her mug, filled to the brim with her morning coffee, in the most unlikely of places throughout her home. First, it was the living room. She turned her back, busying herself with mundane chores. Yet when she returned, the mug was as empty as the silence that filled the room. Next, it was the bathroom, perched precariously on the edge of the sink. She stepped away, counting the seconds as they ticked by. Once again, upon her return, the mug was devoid of its coffee. Then, it was the basement. This time, the wait was agonizing. The anticipation was high. But as had become the norm, she found the mug empty. Its contents vanished. Each room, each experiment, yielded the same result. The coffee would disappear, as if it had mysteriously evaporated. The mystery of the vanishing coffee seemed to mock her, its enigma deepening with each failed attempt to understand it. Even when she tried to catch the phenomenon in the act, she would stand watching with eagle eyes. The results were the same. The moment she'd blink or glance away, the coffee would be gone. It was as if the very act of observing was enough to trigger the event. Despite her meticulous efforts, her logical approach, the mystery remained. The inexplicable disappearance of her coffee was a puzzle that logic couldn't solve. With a heavy sigh, Charlotte realized she was out of her depth. Her experiments had only deepened the mystery rather than solving it. The only thing clear was that something strange was happening in her home, something beyond the realm of the ordinary. Despite her efforts, the mystery remained unsolved. It was time to seek outside help. Charlotte found an unexpected ally in her neighbor, Mrs. Wilkins. A kind and warm-hearted woman, Mrs. Wilkins had lived in Willowbrook for decades. Over a cup of tea on a crisp afternoon, Charlotte confided in Mrs. Wilkins about the vanishing coffee, her voice barely concealing the unease. Mrs. Wilkins listened, her eyes reflecting a deep understanding. She began to share stories of Willowbrook's past, tales that had been passed down from generation to generation. Willowbrook, she began, has always been a place of mystery. It's as if the town is saturated with a spectral energy that weaves itself into our lives. She told stories of items disappearing and reappearing in odd places, of clocks that mysteriously stopped at midnight, only to resume their ticking at dawn. There were tales of strange shadows flitting across the landscape under the moonlight, of whispers carried by the wind, of a ghost-like dog seen roaming the streets at night, only to vanish into thin air. Many believe, Mrs. Wilkins continued, that these occurrences are the work of unseen spirits. They are not malicious, but rather they seem to be seeking connection, looking for something they've lost. Charlotte listened, a chill running down her spine. The tales were eerie, yet oddly comforting. She wasn't alone in her experiences. At least she had some guidance or knowledge that this has happened before. There was a shared understanding, a common thread of the unusual that tied the residents of Willowbrook together. As she walked home that evening, the streets of Willowbrook seemed different, humming with an energy she had never noticed before. Her house now held an air of enigma, its corners shrouded in shadow and mystery. Haunted by these tales, Charlotte could not shake off the feeling of an unseen presence in her house and that she was being watched. The stories had opened her eyes, and now she could feel it, a subtle shift in the air, a soft whisper in the silence, a spectral presence sharing her space. As the clock struck midnight one evening, Charlotte decided to confront whatever was living in her home directly. Charlotte was wide awake, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and anticipation. She stood in her kitchen, the familiar aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafting around her, the only light coming from the glow of the moon outside, and a small lamp beside the couch in the living room. In her hands, she held her favorite mug, filled to the top with the hot, dark Colombian coffee. "I'm tired of doing this. Show yourself," she called out into the silence, her voice steady despite the trembling of her hands. One moment passed, then another. She called out again, and nothing. Just as Charlotte was beginning to think she had imagined it all, she saw it. The coffee in her mug began to swirl, as if stirred by an invisible spoon. She could only watch, entranced, as the liquid spun faster and faster, then abruptly vanished. The mug was now empty once again. But it wasn't the disappearance of her coffee that left Charlotte startled. It was the feeling that washed over her in the wake of the vanishing act. An overwhelming coolness was in the air, despite the heater blasting, as well as a sense of longing, so palpable she could almost touch it. It was a longing that resonated deep within her, echoing her own loneliness in the quiet home. She stood there, in the silence of her kitchen, the empty mug still warm in her hands. The entity was still there, she could feel it. But there was no fear in her now, only a bizarre understanding. This entity, this unseen force that had been draining her coffee, was not there to harm her. It was simply lonely. Possibly it had been emptying her coffee, was just trying to get her attention. Charlotte found herself whispering into the silence, "You're not alone, not anymore." Because in that moment, she realized that she wasn't alone either. She had a companion in her solitude, a kindred spirit in her own home. Was she crazy for talking to this ghost-like being? It was a revelation that would change her life and her perception of the world around her. But that is a story for another time. In the days that followed, Charlotte began to see the phenomenon in a new light. The unseen entity, the phantom coffee drinker, was no longer a source of fear or apprehension, but rather a companion. Charlotte found herself talking to the unseen entity, sharing the minutiae of her day, her dreams, and her thoughts. She had, in her mind at least, befriended the being. It was a peculiar friendship, one that transcended the conventional boundaries of reality. She began to notice the subtle signs of the entity's presence. A gentle breeze in a closed room, a faint humming sound in the quiet hours of the night, the occasional ripple in her coffee, each became a comforting affirmation of her unseen companion. Unseen, yet very much felt. Charlotte no longer felt the need to solve the mystery, to bind it with explanations and logic. Instead, she embraced the enigma, the inexplicable. This acceptance brought a sense of peace, a solace that Charlotte found in this unique companionship. Her perspective shifted. She began to see the world anew, to appreciate the unseen dimensions of life. Charlotte's home at the end of Evergreen Lane was no longer just a house. It was a shared space, a cohabitation between the seen and the unseen, the living and the ethereal. And her daily cup of coffee was no longer just a drink, but an offering, a bridge between two realms. She would make a cup for the being, let it empty the cup, then she would make a cup for herself. In this quiet corner of Willowbrook, Charlotte Evans found an unspoken bond with the unseen entity. She found a connection that transcended the physical, the tangible. In embracing the unknown, Charlotte discovered a deeper understanding of life, of existence, and of the unseen threads that weave the fabric of our reality. Charlotte's experience was more than just a strange occurrence. It was a journey of acceptance and understanding. In the beginning, Charlotte Evans was just like any other resident of Willowbrook, a small town where nothing out of the ordinary ever seemed to happen. But then something peculiar started to occur. Her morning coffee, a simple and mundane part of her daily routine, began to disappear whenever she left the kitchen. It was a mystery that puzzled her, and so she embarked on a journey to unravel the truth. At first, fear and confusion enveloped her. After all, losing something as trivial as a cup of coffee to an unseen entity was enough to unsettle anyone. But Charlotte wasn't one to let fear consume her. She began experimenting, placing her coffee mug in different rooms, only to find it empty upon her return. Each unsuccessful attempt only fueled her curiosity and determination to solve the mystery. Her journey took a turn when she confided in her neighbor, Mrs. Wilkins, who introduced her to the local tales of the supernatural. For some, these stories were mere folklore, but for Charlotte, they provided a new perspective. She began to see her experiences not as mere anomalies, but as potential encounters with the unseen. As the days turned into weeks, Charlotte found herself at the threshold of the supernatural. On a fated midnight, she confronted the unseen entity, her coffee swirling and vanishing right before her eyes. But in that surreal moment, she felt a connection, not one of fear or dread, but a sense of longing, of an entity reaching out from the unseen plane of existence. This was a turning point for Charlotte. She came to realize that the entity was not malicious, but merely a silent companion sharing her space. It was then that she chose to embrace the phenomenon, finding comfort and companionship in its presence. Her morning coffee no longer disappeared mysteriously, but rather it became a shared ritual between her and the unseen entity. Charlotte's story is a testament to the unseen connections in Willowbrook. It's a tale that goes beyond the physical realm, delving into the unseen, the mystical, the connections that bind us all. It's a story of acceptance, understanding, and the realization that we are never truly alone. Charlotte Evans' journey from fear to acceptance leaves us with a thought-provoking question. Do we fear the unknown because it is truly terrifying, or is it our lack of understanding that breeds fear? Perhaps if we choose to embrace the unknown, we might find ourselves sharing a connection beyond what we can see or touch. In the quiet town of Willowbrook, Charlotte Evans found a connection beyond the physical realm. Have you ever experienced something similar?